January 28th, 1595. The sun rises over the domes of Istanbul, casting a golden light on the Bosphorus. But inside the Topkapi Palace, the air is thick with the scent of death. The gates swing open not for a celebration, but for a procession that will haunt the history of the world forever. Out come the coffins, not one, not two, but 19. 19 princes of the Ottoman line carried out in silence. Some of the coffins are large holding men, but most are small, terrifyingly small. They hold the bodies of children, some still infants at the breast who were alive and laughing only hours before. They were not killed by an enemy army. They were not victims of a plague. They were strangled by the order of their own brother, the new Sultan Mehmed III. The crowd gathered outside the palace walls does not cheer for their new ruler. They weep. This was the price of the throne. This was the law of the state. And what happened inside those walls in the dead of night by the hands of deaf-mute executioners is a story so cruel that even the ink of history seems to bleed as we write it. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire. We know it as a superpower that spanned 3 continents, a beacon of culture, architecture, and military might. We admire the tiles of the Blue Mosque and the power of the Janissaries. But beneath the silk caftans and behind the jewel-encrusted doors of the Harem lay a tradition of systematic murder that has no parallel in human history. It was a system where a father's death was a death sentence for his sons, where a brother was not a sibling but a target, where the survival of the state was bought with the blood of innocents. To understand this horror, we must peel back the velvet curtain of the Ottoman court and look into the eyes of the men who made the most impossible choice: kill your own flesh and blood, or watch your empire burn. It began with a logic that was cold, calculating, and terrifyingly practical. In the early days of the empire, succession was a chaotic free-for-all. When a sultan died, his sons would fight civil wars until only one remained. Thousands of soldiers died, cities were burned, the state was weakened. So in the 15th century, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who took Constantinople, decided to end the chaos. He wrote a law into the constitution of the empire, a law known as the Kanun Name. It read, "And to whomsoever of my sons the sultanate shall pass, it is fitting for him to kill his brothers for the sake of the order of the world." Read those words again. It is fitting. It was not a crime. It was a duty. It was a holy obligation. The logic was simple: better that a few princes die than the empire be torn apart by civil war. Better to mourn a brother than to mourn the state. But the execution of this law was anything but simple. It created a palace of paranoia where every prince grew up knowing that his life hung by a thread, and that the thread would be cut the moment his father took his last breath. The execution itself was designed to be respectful. In Ottoman tradition, the blood of the royal family was sacred. It could not be spilled on the ground. Therefore, they could not be beheaded. They could not be stabbed. They had to be extinguished like a candle. The method was strangulation, a silken bowstring or a velvet curtain cord tightened around the neck. And the men who performed this duty, they were the Dilsiz, the silent ones. The palace employed a corps of deaf-mute executioners. These men, unable to hear the screams and unable to speak of what they saw, were the perfect instruments of death. They were strong, loyal, and terrifyingly efficient. Imagine being a young prince waking up in the middle of the night. The door to your chamber opens, no words are spoken. You see only the shadows of large men moving toward your bed, holding a coiled cord. You know who they are. You know why they are here. There is no trial. There is no appeal. There's only the grip of strong hands and the tightening of the cord. This was the fate that awaited the brothers of the Sultan. But as the centuries passed, the brutality escalated. It went from the execution of grown men who might lead rebellions to the slaughter of helpless children who could barely walk. And no event captures this descent into madness better than the reign of Murad III and his son Mehmed III. It is here that we find the darkest night in the 600-year history of the dynasty, a night where the corridors of the harem ran with the tears of mothers and where the concept of justice was strangled alongside 19 innocent souls. To understand the full weight of that night in 1595, we must first understand the mechanics of the transition. In the Ottoman Empire, there was no concept of primogeniture. The eldest son did not automatically inherit the throne. All sons were equal in the eyes of the law, and all were equally dangerous. When a sultan died, the news was often kept a closely guarded secret. The Grand Vizier would seal the palace gates, cut off communication with the outside world, and send secret riders galloping across the plains of Anatolia to the provinces where the princes served as governors. It was a race, a literal race for survival. The prince who reached Constantinople first, who bribed the right guards, who seized the treasury and the holy standard, he became the sultan. And the moment he sat on the throne, the clock started ticking for his brothers. If you were slow, if your horse stumbled, if your messenger was intercepted, you were dead. In 1574, when Sultan Selim II died, his son Murad III won this race. His first act as sultan was to order the strangulation of his 5 younger brothers. The palace was filled with the sounds of mourning, but the ulama, the religious scholars, nodded their heads. They said it was tragic, yes, but necessary. They quoted the law, "Sedition is worse than slaughter." 5 coffins were carried out. The people wept, but they accepted it. They thought this was the worst it could get. They were wrong. Murad III went on to have a long reign. He spent his days in the harem, fathering an obscene number of children. By the time he lay on his deathbed in January 1595, he had fathered over 100 children. When he finally breathed his last, he left behind a staggering number of sons. His eldest, Mehmed III, was a man of 30 years. He was hardened, paranoid, and fully aware of his duty. He arrived at the Topkapi Palace under the cover of darkness. He viewed his father's corpse, said a prayer, and then he gave the order. What followed is the single most grotesque event in the annals of the Ottoman dynasty. It wasn't a race anymore. The other princes were already in the palace. They were children. Most of them had not even reached the age of puberty. They were kept in the cafes, the cage, or in the nursery with their mothers. They posed no military threat. They commanded no armies. They barely knew how to speak. The chief of the black eunuchs was given the list, 19 names. He summoned the deaf-mute executioners. These men with their thick arms and silent eyes moved through the corridors of the harem like ghosts. They entered the nursery. Imagine the scene. The mothers, realizing what was happening, throwing themselves over the cribs of their sons, screaming, scratching at the faces of the executioners, begging for mercy in the name of Allah. They had to be dragged away by force, their fingernails torn, their voices hoarse from screaming. One of the princes, a boy named Mahmud, was reportedly wide awake when the executioners entered. He was eating roasted chestnuts, a small comfort in a cold winter night. When he saw the men approaching with the silk cord, he didn't understand the finality of death. He looked up at the executioner, a man he perhaps recognized, and innocently asked if he could finish his chestnuts before they hurt him. The executioner did not answer. He could not hear, and he could not speak. He simply looped the cord around the small, fragile neck of the prince. The chestnuts rolled across the floor. The struggle lasted only seconds. The boy's face turned purple, his legs kicked against the silk sheets, and then stillness. Multiply this scene by 19. 19 times the cord was tightened. 19 times a life was snuffed out. 19 times a body was washed, wrapped in a white shroud, and placed in a wooden box. The next morning, the citizens of Constantinople gathered at the palace gates to pay respects to the old sultan. But they were greeted by a parade of horror. The coffin of Murad III was followed by 19 smaller coffins. The chroniclers of the time tell us that the wailing of the people was so loud it could be heard across the Bosphorus. It was a sound of collective trauma. Even the most hardened soldiersmen who had seen the carnage of the battlefield wept openly in the streets. They called it the harvest of death. Mehmed III sat on his throne undisputed. He was the master of the world. But he was also a man who had walked over the corpses of toddlers to get there. The law of fratricide had achieved its goal. There was no civil war. There was no challenger. But the soul of the empire had been stained irrevocably. The brutality of the act was so extreme, so visceral, that it shocked the conscience of the nation. It was the breaking point. The people and even the palace officials began to whisper that there must be another way, that a throne built on the bones of children was cursed. And indeed, it seemed the curse was real. Mehmed III's reign was plagued by rebellion and dissatisfaction. The ghosts of the 19 seemed to haunt the corridors of Topkapi. And when Mehmed himself died 8 years later, his son Ahmed I looked at the history of his father, and grandfather looked at the coffins of his uncles, and made a decision that would change everything. He refused to kill his brother, but in doing so, he created a new kind of hell. A hell not of blood, but of madness. Sultan Ahmed the Firm was only 13 years old when he ascended the throne in 1603. He was a boy standing in the shadow of a massacre. He had a younger brother Mustafa who was seen as mentally fragile. The advisors, the viziers, and the executioners all waited for the order. They prepared the bowstring, but the order never came. Ahmed looked at his brother, perhaps remembering the stories of the Chestnut Prince, and he could not do it. He broke the bloody chain of history. He spared Mustafa's life. But mercy in the Ottoman Empire was a complicated thing. You could not kill the prince, but you could not let him be free either. A free prince was a magnet for rebellion. He could raise an army. He could challenge the sultan. So they invented a solution that was less bloody than the bowstring, but perhaps infinitely more cruel to the human mind. They invented the cafes, the cage. The cafes was not a dungeon with iron bars and rats. It was a gilded apartment located deep within the harem of the Topkapi Palace. The rooms were luxurious. The floors were covered in thick Persian carpets. The walls were adorned with exquisite tiles. The princes had food, they had books, and they had servants. But they had no life. Once a prince entered the cage, the doors were locked. The windows were barred. They were cut off from the world entirely. They could not leave the room. They could not have children. Their concubines were given strict medicines to prevent pregnancy, or if a child was conceived, it was aborted immediately. They could not speak to anyone outside of a few deaf-mute servants and sterile concubines. They were ghosts living in a golden box. Imagine the psychological torture. You enter the cage as a young man. You wait for the sultan to die. That is your only exit. But you don't know when that will be. It could be next week. It could be in 40 years. Every time footsteps approached the door, the princes in the cage would freeze in terror. Was it the executioner coming to finish the job? Or was it the herald coming to tell them they were now the emperor of the world? They lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing suspense. Let's return to Mustafa, the brother Ahmed spared. He spent 14 years in the cage, 14 years of silence, 14 years of staring at the same four walls. When Ahmed died in 1617, the officials unlocked the door and told Mustafa he was now sultan. They dragged him out into the sunlight. The man who emerged was broken. His mind had shattered in the isolation. He was terrified of people. During council meetings, he would giggle uncontrollably. He would pull on the beards of his viziers. He was seen throwing coins into the Bosphorus, saying he was feeding the fish. He was convinced his dead brother was still alive. He would wander the palace corridors, knocking on doors, crying out for Ahmed to come and save him from the burden of power. The empire had traded a massacre for a madman. Mustafa was deposed after only 3 months, thrown back into the cage, and then pulled out again years later, even more insane than before. This became the new pattern. The Ottoman dynasty began to produce a line of sultans who were mentally unstable, socially crippled, and totally unprepared to rule. They were men who had known nothing but the terror of the executioner and the silence of the prison. But the story of the cage has even darker chapters. There's the story of Ibrahim the Mad. Ibrahim had spent 22 years in the cafes. He had watched his brothers get strangled one by his ruthless older brother Murad IV. Ibrahim lived in constant fear. He was the last one left. He knew his turn was coming. When Murad IV finally died, the viziers rushed to Ibrahim's cell to tell him the news. "Hail Sultan," they cried. But Ibrahim did not celebrate. He terrified. He barred the door. He pushed furniture against it. He screamed that it was a trick, a trap to get him to come out so the executioners could kill him. He refused to open the door. The most powerful men in the empire had to physically break down the door of the cage. Even then, Ibrahim cowered in the corner, weeping, begging for his life. They had to drag the corpse of his dead brother and dump it on the floor in front of him just to prove he was safe. Only when he touched the cold, dead hand of his tormentor did he believe. Ibrahim became sultan, but the damage was done. His reign was a spectacle of depravity and madness that shocked even the hardened people of Istanbul. He was obsessed with furs and scents. He ordered the execution of his entire harem, 280 women, tied in sacks and drowned in the Bosphorus because of a rumor. He was a monster created by the system designed to save the state. The cage solved the problem of civil war, yes, but it rotted the dynasty from the inside out. It turned the sultans from warrior kings into frightened, neurotic prisoners. And as the quality of the leaders declined, the great empire began its long, slow slide into ruin. However, the shadow of the bowstring never truly went away. Even with the cage, the threat of death remained. And sometimes the violence wasn't just about politics. Sometimes it was about pure, unadulterated hatred. If the cage created madmen, then the reign of Sultan Murad IV proved that a sane sultan could be far, far more terrifying than a crazy one. Murad was not a giggling recluse like Mustafa, nor a neurotic coward like Ibrahim. He was a monster of a different breed. He was a giant of a man, a warrior who could reportedly lift a mace weighing 200 pounds with a single hand. He was the restorer of the empire's military glory, the conqueror of Baghdad. But inside the palace, he was the angel of death incarnate. Murad IV ascended the throne as a child, witnessing the anarchy of the Janissaries, who dragged grand viziers out of meetings and hacked them to pieces. He grew up watching his mother, the powerful Kosem Sultan, rule from the shadows. The lesson he learned was simple. Power is only real if it is absolute, and absolute power requires blood. When Murad came of age and seized control, he turned Istanbul into a city of silence. He banned coffee, he banned tobacco, he banned alcohol. He believed these were the breeding grounds of sedition where men gathered to whisper against the Sultan. But he didn't just pass laws, he enforced them with a personal sadistic zeal. Legend tells us that Murad would roam the streets of Istanbul at night, disguised as a commoner. He would wander into taverns or approach men on the street asking to buy tobacco. If a man obliged him, if a shopkeeper sold him a drink, the Sultan would throw off his disguise. He would reveal himself, draw his sword, and behead the man right there on the cobblestones. The next morning, citizens would wake to find headless bodies lying in the gutters, a grim reminder that the Sultan's eyes were everywhere. It is estimated that in a span of 5 years, he executed over 25,000 people. But his cruelty towards his subjects paled in comparison to what he did to his own blood. Murad had 4 brothers, Bayezid, Suleiman, Qasim, and the youngest Ibrahim. Despite the establishment of the cage, Murad did not trust walls to keep him safe. He looked at his brothers and saw only potential rivals. He saw the faces of men who might one day steal his crown. And for Murad, the only safe rival was a dead rival. The tragedy of Prince Bayezid is particularly heartbreaking. Bayezid was a skilled warrior, a poet, and beloved by the people. He was everything a sultan should be, which was exactly why he had to die. In 1635, Murad marched his army east to recapture the city of Revan. He took his brothers with him on the campaign. Imagine the psychological terror, riding alongside your brother the Sultan, knowing he is watching your every move, knowing that if you ride too well, you are a threat. If you ride too poorly, you are a disgrace. The Ottomans won the victory at Revan. The camp was filled with celebration. Cannons were fired, feasts were prepared. In the middle of this jubilation, while the soldiers were cheering Murad's name, the Sultan sent his executioners to the tents of his brothers Bayezid and Suleiman. They were strangled while the fireworks of victory exploded in the sky above them. The celebration of the empire's triumph was the soundtrack to their murder. Murad returned to Istanbul a hero, leaving the corpses of his brothers behind in the dust of the frontier. He had revived the old law of fratricide, not out of legal obligation, but out of sheer paranoid will. A few years later, it was Prince Qasim's turn. Qasim was locked in the cage in Istanbul. Murad, fearing a conspiracy, gave the order. The deaf mutes entered the gilded apartment. Qasim, unlike the others, fought back. He was young and strong. He struggled against the executioners, knocking one down, fighting for his breath, fighting for his life. But he was outnumbered. The cord was tightened. When Murad came to inspect the body, he reportedly looked at his brother's purple, swollen face and felt nothing. No remorse, no sadness, only the satisfaction of a problem solved. This left only one brother, Ibrahim, the terrified, mentally unstable Ibrahim we spoke of earlier. Murad despised him. He thought Ibrahim was weak, unworthy a stain on the dynasty. As Murad lay on his own deathbed in 1640, dying of cirrhosis of the liver at the age of 27, his hatred burned until the very end. He gave one final shocking command. He ordered the execution of Ibrahim. Think about what that meant. Ibrahim was the last surviving male of the Ottoman line. If Ibrahim died, the dynasty, the House of Osman that had ruled for 350 years, would end. The empire would dissolve into chaos. But Murad didn't care. In his fevered, dying mind, he believed that if he could not rule, no one should. He wanted to take the entire empire into the grave with him. It was only the intervention of his mother, Kosem Sultan, that saved Ibrahim. She physically blocked the executioners, telling them the Sultan was delirious, that the order was invalid. Murad died believing his order would be carried out. He died wanting to commit the ultimate fratricide, the murder of his own family line. This was the legacy of the Ottomans. It was a pendulum swinging between the massacre of children and the torture of isolation. But the horror wasn't just confined to the princes. To truly understand the sickness of the system, we must look at the women. We must look at the mothers, the wives, and the daughters who were trapped in this machinery of death. For inside the harem, the battle for survival was just as bloody, but it was fought with poison secrets and a different kind of strangulation. When we think of the Ottoman harem, Western art has taught us to visualize a paradise of leisure, beautiful women lounging on silk cushions, eating Turkish delight, bathing in marble pools. It is an image of erotic fantasy, but the reality was closer to a high-security prison, crossed with a snake pit. The harem was not a brothel. It was a political arena where the losers didn't just lose their jobs, they lost their lives. For a woman in the harem, giving birth to a son was the greatest blessing and the greatest curse. A son meant power. If your son became sultan, you became the Valid Sultan, the queen mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. You ruled the harem, you advised the sultan, you controlled the treasury. But if another woman's son became sultan, your son would be strangled. And you would be exiled to the old palace, a place of weeping and shadows or worse. This brutal reality turned mothers into monsters. They weren't just raising children, they were raising survivors. They had to be spies, poisoners, and diplomats. Every bite of food their son took had to be tasted. Every servant had to be vetted. Every night was a sleepless vigil against the silent tread of the executioner. No woman embodies this terrifying duality better than Kosem Sultan. Kosem was a Greek slave girl who rose to become the master of the empire. She was the wife of Ahmed the Persian, the mother of Murad IV and Ibrahim. She dominated the Ottoman world for half a century. She was brilliant, ruthless, and seemingly indestructible. But her story ends in one of the most gruesome scenes ever witnessed in the palace. After her son Ibrahim was deposed and killed, a story of its own tragedy, Kosem's grandson Mehmed IV took the throne. He was a child only 6 years old. Kosem expected to rule through him just as she had done with her sons. But she met her match in the boy's mother, Turhan Sultan. Turhan was young, but she was fierce. She refused to be a puppet. A cold war erupted in the harem. Two queens, grandmother and mother, fighting for the soul of the boy sultan. It ended on the night of September 6, 1651. Kosem Sultan decided to launch a coup. She planned to poison the child Sultan Mehmed IV and replace him with another grandson who would be easier to control. Think about that. A grandmother plotting to kill her own 6-year-old grandson for political leverage. But one of her servants, a girl named Meliki, betrayed her. She whispered the plot to Turhan Sultan. Turhan did not hesitate. She summoned the black eunuchs, the guardians of the harem. These were tall, powerful men armed with axes and swords. They stormed Kosem's chambers in the dead of night. The scene that followed was chaotic and savage. Kosem, an old woman in her 60s, realized she was cornered. She tried to hide in a closet, stuffing her pockets with gold and jewels, perhaps hoping to bribe her way out. But the eunuchs dragged her out by her clothes. It is recorded that Kosem fought like a lioness. She was not a frail old lady. She was the Valid Sultan. But she was overpowered. The eunuchs stripped her of her jewelry. They tore her clothes. And then in the heart of the palace, she had ruled for decades, they strangled her. But they didn't have a bowstring. They used the curtains. They used her own hair. It was a messy, brutal, undignified end. When it was over, her body was dragged out into the snow. The most powerful woman in Ottoman history, the Great Mother, left as a heap of bruised flesh in the courtyard. Her death marked the end of an era, but it highlighted the central sickness of the system. The law of fratricide in the cage didn't just destroy the men, it corrupted the women. It forced them to choose between their humanity and their children's survival. It turned the harem into a factory of trauma where love was a weakness and ruthlessness was the only virtue. And yet, as the empire entered the 18th and 19th centuries, the bloodshed began to change. The literal strangulations stopped. The Ottomans, trying to modernize, trying to look civilized to the Europeans, stopped killing the princes. But the cruelty didn't disappear. It just evolved. It became colder. It became bureaucratic. Instead of death, the later princes faced a different kind of erasure. They were kept alive, yes, but they were forbidden from having families. If a prince in the 19th century, a refined, educated man who spoke French and played the piano, fell in love with a concubine, it was allowed. But if she became pregnant, the horror returned. There are accounts from the 19th century, well into the Victorian era, of palace doctors performing forced abortions on the concubines of princes. Or worse, if a baby was born in secret, the midwife would receive a silent order. The baby would be not breathed, a hand over the mouth, a damp cloth, a tragic stillbirth recorded in the official registers. The prince would weep for his lost child, never knowing, or perhaps knowing all too well, that his father, the Sultan, had ordered the death of his own grandchild to prevent a succession crisis. The bowstring had been replaced by the surgical tool. The deaf-mute executioner had been replaced by the palace doctor. But the logic remained the same. The survival of the state is worth any price. When the end finally came for the Ottoman Empire, it did not come with the snap of a bowstring. It came with a signature on a piece of paper. In 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. The empire that had terrified Europe for 6 centuries, the dynasty that had survived by devouring its own children, was finally dead. On a rainy night in March 1924, the last members of the Ottoman dynasty were ordered to leave the new Republic of Turkey. They were given passports that were valid for only one trip, a one-way ticket to exile. The princes, the sultans, the powerful mothers, they were packed onto trains and ships cast out into a world they barely understood. The irony is suffocating. For centuries, they had killed their brothers to keep the throne. They had strangled toddlers to secure their place in the palace. And in the end, they lost it all anyway. The palace they had drenched in blood was taken from them, turned into a museum for tourists to gawk at. Today, if you visit Istanbul, you can walk through the Topkapi Palace. You can pay a ticket and enter the Harem. It is beautiful. The Iznik tiles shine with a mesmerizing blue. The stained glass windows cast a kaleidoscope of light onto the marble floors. It is quiet, peaceful. But if you know the history, the silence is not peaceful. It is heavy. Walk down the long, narrow corridor known as the Golden Road. This is where the executioners walked. Stand in the courtyard of the Valid Sultan. This is where Kosem was dragged through the snow. And if you look closely at the entrance to the harem, you might find the room that was the cage. It stands empty now. The silk cushions are gone. The princes who paced the floors, driving themselves into madness, have turned to dust. But the air in that room still feels thick. It is a monument to the ultimate failure of the human heart. The Ottoman Empire is often called the sick man of Europe in its final years. Historians usually mean this politically, that its economy was failing. Its army was weak, but perhaps the sickness was deeper. Perhaps the sickness began 400 years earlier, on the day Mehmed the Conqueror wrote that fatal line, "It is fitting for him to kill his brothers." That law planted a seed of rot in the foundation of the state. It taught the rulers that human life, even the life of your own family, is disposable in the face of power. It created a system where love was a liability and paranoia was a survival skill. It saved the state from civil war, yes, but it cost the state its soul. We look back at these sultans, Murad, the cruel Mehmed, the fratricide, Ibrahim the mad, and it is easy to see them as monsters. But they were also victims. They were children born into a game. They did not choose a game where the only rules were kill or be killed. They were prisoners of their own heritage, trapped in a golden cage of fear until the very end. So the next time you see a picture of the glorious Ottoman court with its jewels and its majesty, look closer. Look past the turban and the sword. Look for the shadow in the corner. Look for the small coffin being carried out the back gate. And listen. Listen closely to the silence of history. Because if you listen hard enough beneath the call to prayer and the waves of the Bosphorus, you might still hear the faint, tragic sound of a chestnut rolling across the floor and the voice of a child asking if he can finish his snack. Before the darkness comes,